Most people remember wartime rationing as a matter of inconvenience. Shorter supplies, longer queues, smaller portions. But for millions of civilians during World War II, the real rupture came when entire categories of food disappeared at once. Not just less sugar, not just less dairy. In many places, the basic structural ingredients of everyday cooking, sweeteners, fats, and refined grain, vanished simultaneously. Families weren't simply substituting brands. They were, rebuilding the idea of dessert and comfort food from scratch, often with whatever could be grown, gathered, or extracted locally. Before we begin, if you value serious, research-driven survival history like this, subscribe to the Survival Record and stay with us for the full series. What follows isn't nostalgia cooking, it's a record of improvisation under systemic scarcity, solutions shaped by logistics, agriculture, and state policy. The first thing to understand is that wartime shortages forced civilians to reinvent what street food even meant. In the United Kingdom, sugar rationing began early and stayed strict for years. In Germany, industrial blockade and agricultural disruption created chronic shortages of fats and refined grains. In Japan, maritime interdictions severed access to imported staples. And in the Soviet Union, scorched earth warfare stripped entire regions of stored food. Across these very different societies, one pattern repeated. Families still sought morale food, something sweet, or at least comforting, something to mark a birthday, a holiday, or simply survival through another week. The results were what we might call junk foods, but not in the modern sense of excess calories. These were improvised, high-effort comfort foods made without ingredients that had defined baking for centuries. Carrots quietly replaced sugar in more ways than most people realize. Carrots became one of the most important sweetening agents of the war. They were hardy, widely grown, and naturally high in sugar relative to other vegetables. British households boiled carrots down into dense syrups, which were then reduced further into something resembling fudge. When mashed and cooked slowly, carrot pulp caramelized enough to provide both sweetness and texture. The famous carrot fudge and carrot toffee weren't really culinary novelties. They were practical chemistry, Heating released sugars while driving off water, creating structure without any dairy fat or refined sugar. But honestly, the psychological function mattered just as much as nutrition. Something sticky and sweet meant continuity with pre-war life, a small taste of normalcy. Even today, modern survival manuals still note the value of high-sugar root vegetables for emergency sweeteners. That lesson, it was learned at the civilian level first. Potatoes stopped being just a side dish and instead became the structural base of sweets. Potatoes were one of the few calorie-dense crops that remained reliable across much of Europe, which was pretty crucial. Families learned to transform mashed potatoes into dense confection bases. When combined with grated vegetables, beet syrup, or ground nuts, when available, they formed cakes, bars, and pressed sweets. The key advantage here was starch gelatinization. When cooked and cooled, potatoes actually hold their shape in a way that mimics flour-based dough. This allowed families to construct sliceable treats without any grain. In regions facing long winters, potato sweets also stored relatively well, especially when dried or baked firm. They functioned as morale rations that could be portioned carefully, an early example of civilian food engineered for both durability and emotional value at the same time. Beet syrup replaced refined sugar and, honestly, reshaped entire flavor profiles. Sugar beets had long been an industrial crop, but wartime scarcity pushed extraction right into home kitchens. Boiling chopped beets for hours produced a thick, dark syrup. It was earthy, slightly bitter, and far less refined than commercial sugar, but it worked. Families used beet reduction to bind roasted grain substitutes, vegetable pulp or nut meal into dense candy-like blocks. In Central and Eastern Europe, beet syrup confections became so common that children grew up associating their flavor with celebration. What's often overlooked is how this actually normalized strong vegetal sweetness. Post-war food industries in several countries retained darker syrups in processed goods, which is a direct carryover from emergency practice. Acorns were transformed from famine food into something resembling dessert. In forested regions, acorns became a crucial fallback carbohydrate. Normally considered bitter and inedible without processing, they were soaked, ground, and repeatedly rinsed to remove tannins. Once rendered mild, acorn meal could be pressed into pastes and sweetened with whatever syrup was available. Some families shaped acorn paste into small moulded sweets, dried them near stoves, and stored them like candy. Others mixed acorn meal with mashed vegetables to create dense snack loaves that could be sliced thin. This was labor-intensive food, but that labor carried survival value. Knowledge of tannin removal and wild carbohydrate processing later influenced post-war survival training manuals in both Europe and Asia. Pumpkin and squash pulp became, the backbone of improvised confectionery. Pumpkins store well and contain natural sugars. When cooked down extensively, their pulp thickens into a paste that can be shaped, dried, or baked into, firm slices. Without milk or flour, this paste functioned as both binder and bulk. In parts of East Asia and Eastern Europe, families pressed pumpkin paste into shallow trays and dried it slowly, producing chewy slabs similar to fruit leather. When cut into small squares, these were treated as sweets for children. The practice reinforced a critical wartime principle. Preservation through dehydration is often more reliable than preservation through fat or sugar, especially when those are scarce. Roasted chicory and other roots created candy-like bitterness people learned to crave. Chicory is best known as a coffee substitute, but its roasted root also contributed to confection experiments. When finely ground and mixed with thick vegetable pastes or syrups, it produced dense, slightly bitter sweets. These weren't attempts to mimic chocolate exactly. They filled the psychological space of complex roasted flavor, something normally supplied by cocoa, which had become inaccessible in many regions. Taste adaptation is an underappreciated survival mechanism. Entire populations learned to interpret bitterness as comfort rather than deprivation. Bean paste sweets crossed cultural boundaries and became emergency nutrition. In East Asia, sweet bean paste already had culinary tradition. Wartime scarcity broadened their use dramatically. Without refined sugar, beans were mashed and combined with minimal sweetening, sometimes just concentrated vegetable reductions. The result was dense, protein-rich snack blocks that traveled well and required no dairy or flour. In areas facing disrupted supply lines, these functioned as portable civilian ration food long before formal emergency rations were standardized. This convergence of cultural tradition and survival necessity demonstrates how existing food knowledge can become strategic resilience under pressure. Rice bran and milling byproducts became the raw material of improvised snack foods. When whole grains were diverted to military use, civilians often received only milling residue. Rice bran, normally discarded or used as animal feed, became an edible resource. Mixed with vegetable pulp and pressed into thin sheets, then toasted, rice bran formed brittle snack crackers. They were coarse, slightly oily, and nutritionally dense. More importantly, they represented full utilization of supply chains under stress. Modern zero-waste food movements often trace philosophical roots to wartime necessity. Nothing edible could remain unused when logistics collapsed. Even fruit peels were processed into chewy sweets when nothing else remained. Apple, citrus, and melon peels were boiled repeatedly, softened, and then dried into candied strips, often without sugar, relying instead on concentration and natural residual sweetness. This practice served dual purposes, extracting every possible calorie and preserving micronutrients normally discarded. It also maintained the ritual of offering something small and sweet after meals. Ritual continuity is a survival tool rarely acknowledged in military histories but constantly visible in civilian behavior. These foods mattered not because they were delicious, but because they preserved structure in daily life. None of these inventions were luxuries. They were systems for maintaining normalcy under prolonged strain. When ingredients central to identity and culture disappear, improvisation becomes psychological infrastructure. Governments studied these adaptations closely. The British Ministry of Food documented civilian substitutions to refine ration policy. Military planners later integrated similar principles into survival training. Prioritize adaptable calorie sources, preserve morale rituals, and exploit local plant chemistry. Civilian kitchens became laboratories of resilience. What these improvised junk foods teach us about preparedness is still relevant today. They reveal that survival is rarely about heroic endurance. It is about technical creativity applied to ordinary needs: sweetness, texture, celebration, routine. Remove the foundational ingredients of modern diets, and people will still reconstruct meaning from what remains. More importantly, they demonstrate that knowledge, not stockpiles, is the decisive resource. Knowing how to extract sugar from vegetables, remove bitterness from wild foods, or restructure starch into stable form turns scarcity into solvable problem. World War II reshaped military doctrine, geopolitics, and industrial capacity. But it also reshaped the smallest domestic decisions: what counts as a treat, how flavor is built, how morale is maintained with almost nothing. Those quiet reinventions rarely appear in battlefield narratives. Yet, they are among the clearest records of how societies actually survive total war. Understanding these lesser-known civilian adaptations matters because they show survival not as theory, but as lived practice, tested across continents, climates, and political systems. They remind us that resilience is built in kitchens as much as in command centers. If you value in-depth historical analysis like this, subscribe to The Survival Record and share this video with others who want the overlooked lessons of history, not just the headlines.